She married a millionaire CEO by contract. But his one condition shocked his shy secretary. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. Claire Whitman had always believed that if she stayed quiet, worked hard, and kept her head down, life would eventually reward her with stability, not miracles, just something calm and predictable. And that belief was what carried her every morning through the revolving glass doors of Caldwell Enterprises, a 60-story tower of steel and light rising over downtown Chicago, where the elevators whispered, the floors gleamed, and people spoke in confident tones she never quite borrowed for herself. And on that particular Tuesday morning, with a thin layer of frost still clinging to the sidewalks outside and her sensible heels clicking softly across marble, Claire had no idea that her routine was about to fracture in a way no spreadsheet or calendar reminder could prepare her for. She was the executive secretary to Ethan Caldwell, the company's founder and CEO, a man whose presence seemed to bend the air around him, not because he raised his voice, but because he never had to. A man who wore tailored suits like armor and spoke with a precision that made meetings end early and decisions feel final. And for 3 years, Claire had been the quiet constant at his side, managing schedules, filtering calls, and smoothing chaos without ever stepping into the spotlight herself. That morning, however, when his assistant line blinked twice and his voice came through calm but unmistakably serious, asking her to come into his office immediately, something in her chest tightened. Not fear exactly, but the sense that the ground beneath her careful life had shifted an inch to the left. His office, all glass and dark wood, overlooked the city like a chessboard, and as she stepped inside, clutching her tablet a little too tightly, she noticed details she normally ignored, the way the blinds were half drawn despite the clear sky, the way Ethan stood instead of sitting, his jacket draped over the chair as if he had no intention of staying comfortable. He did not invite her to sit. He did not offer small talk. He simply looked at her, really looked at her, as though she were not just the woman who organized his life, but a solution he had been measuring carefully. Claire, he said, using her name in a way that made it feel heavier than usual. I'm going to make you an offer, and before you answer, I need you to understand that this stays between us. Her mouth went dry, her instincts urging her to apologize for something she didn't yet know she'd done. But instead she nodded, because nodding was safer than speaking. Ethan continued, explaining that a pending merger, delicate family expectations, and a board hungry for stability had converged into a single, unreasonable demand, one he refused to let dictate his future. And then, without drama, without raised eyebrows or softened tone, he said the words that rearranged her understanding of him and of herself. I need a wife. Claire, not for love, not for appearances alone, but by contract, for a fixed term, with clear rules, and I want you to be that wife. The room seemed to narrow, the city beyond the glass blurring as her heartbeat filled her ears, because this was not a proposal from a romantic novel. It was a calculated request from the most powerful man she knew. And before she could find her voice, he added, almost gently, there is one condition, and it is non-negotiable. A condition that would soon shock the shy secretary who had spent her life trying not to be seen. Claire did not remember how she left Ethan Caldwell's office, only that a few minutes later she was standing in the women's restroom on the 48th floor, hands braced against cool marble, staring at her reflection as if it belonged to someone else, someone reckless enough to be offered a contract marriage by a billionaire CEO and not laugh outright, because nothing in her life had ever prepared her for a moment like this. Not the quiet mornings in her small apartment on the north side. Not the careful budgeting spreadsheets she updated every Sunday night. Not the way she folded her coats by season to make the closet feel bigger than it was. She had built her life around control, around modest expectations, and that was precisely why Ethan's words kept echoing in her head, not as fantasy, but as a problem she could not solve by being organized. By lunchtime, the shock had settled into something heavier, a pressure that followed her back to her desk, where emails stacked up and calendars demanded answers as if the world had not just tilted. Claire tried to focus, but her thoughts drifted to her father's voicemail from the night before. His voice worn thin with apology as he mentioned the final notice taped to the door of the auto shop he had run for 30 years, the shop that smelled like oil and coffee and childhood Saturdays, now facing foreclosure after months of declining business and medical bills that insurance never fully covered. She had not told Ethan any of that, of course, because she had learned early that personal struggles were not currency in professional spaces, but they were the quiet math behind every decision she made. Her salary was good, stable, enough to keep her afloat and help her parents, just enough to delay the inevitable, but not enough to rescue them, not enough to buy time, not enough to fix what was breaking. When Ethan called her back into his office later that afternoon, she felt the weight of that truth pressing against her ribs, and this time she sat when he gestured to the chair, because standing felt like surrender. He spoke calmly, outlining logistics, timelines, confidentiality, legal counsel, all the things that made the proposal sound less like a personal boundary crossed and more like a transaction she had been trained to manage. And yet when he mentioned the compensation, the number landed between them like a held breath, enough to erase her father's debt, enough to secure her parents' home, enough to free her from the constant, quiet fear of one emergency away from losing everything. Claire hated herself for noticing that, for letting relief flicker before doubt rushed back in, because accepting meant stepping into a life she had only observed from behind a desk, a life of cameras and expectations and scrutiny she had spent years avoiding by being invisible. That night, she walked home instead of taking the bus, letting the cold air sting her cheeks as if clarity might come with each step, passing brownstones and corner stores lit by neon signs, thinking about how carefully she had constructed a life where no one asked too much of her, where her biggest risks were saying no or staying late. Marriage, even a temporary one, was not careful, and marrying her boss was something else entirely, a line she had never imagined crossing, let alone considering. Yet as she unlocked her apartment door and glanced at the stack of unopened medical bills on the counter, the answer she wanted and the answer she needed pulled in opposite directions, and for the first time in a very long time, Claire Whitman understood that staying safe might cost her more than taking the risk ever could. The following morning, Claire sat across from Ethan in a quiet conference room that overlooked the river, the city still waking below them, sunlight catching on the water in a way that felt almost unfairly calm given the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. And between them lay a slim folder, neatly aligned with the edge of the table, its clean lines somehow more intimidating than any raised voice could have been. Ethan did not rush her. He never rushed anything. He explained that the contract was structured for 1 year, renewable only by mutual consent, that it would include full legal protection, private counsel of her choosing, and a public narrative crafted to satisfy the board and the press without exposing her to unnecessary scrutiny. And as he spoke, Claire found herself appreciating the clarity even as she resented how reasonable it all sounded. He slid the folder toward her and said softly that she should read every word, that nothing would be hidden, because trust, even a manufactured version of it, required transparency. Claire opened the folder with careful fingers, her eyes moving line by line, absorbing clauses about confidentiality, appearances, shared residences, and boundaries that felt oddly comforting in their specificity, until she reached the section labeled personal conduct, where the language shifted from procedural to personal in a way that made her pause. Ethan noticed immediately. "That is the condition," he said, his voice steady but no longer detached, and when she looked up, she saw something unfamiliar in his expression, not coldness, but restraint. He explained that in public, she would be everything expected of a CEO's wife, composed, elegant, supportive, prepared. To stand beside him at galas, charity dinners, and board functions without hesitation, because the image mattered more than either of them liked to admit, but in private, behind closed doors and away from cameras, she was not allowed to perform, not allowed to reshape herself into what she thought he wanted. "You do not pretend with me," he said, "not your opinions, not your discomfort, not your kindness, and most of all, not your feelings." Claire blinked, confused by a condition that felt backward, almost cruel in its insistence on honesty. "Anymore." The wedding happened quietly on a Friday afternoon that felt deliberately ordinary, as if the city itself had agreed not to stare. A private civil ceremony in a downtown office with a neutral carpet and framed city permits on the walls. No music, no guests beyond two witnesses, and a lawyer who spoke in a practiced, even tone. And when Claire said yes, her voice did not shake, not because she was fearless, but because she had already crossed the hardest threshold by agreeing to be here at all. By Monday morning, the ordinary was gone. Claire Whitman became Claire Caldwell on paper, and with that single change, her life accelerated in ways she could barely track, fitting schedule between meetings, briefings over coffee that cost more than her weekly grocery budget used to, a stylist who spoke gently but decisively, explaining silhouettes and colors as if translating a language Claire had heard but never spoken. She learned how to stand beside Ethan without shrinking, how to walk at his pace without rushing, how to meet a stranger's gaze and hold it just long enough to be polite but not inviting. And in public, she performed the role with a precision that surprised even her, because competence was something she understood, even if confidence was still unfamiliar. Cameras flashed at the first charity dinner, their light sharp and sudden, reporters calling her name with practiced warmth. And Claire smiled because smiling was easier than thinking, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's arm as if it had always belonged there. While inside, she cataloged details to stay grounded. The chill of the evening air, the steady weight of his presence, the hum of traffic beyond the crowd. Yet it was the private moments that unsettled her most. In the penthouse Ethan had arranged for them, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture chosen for impact rather than comfort, she felt more exposed than she ever had in front of an audience, because here, there were no scripts, no expectations beyond the one condition she could not forget. The first night, she hovered near the kitchen counter, unsure where to place herself, unsure which version of herself to offer, and when she apologized out of habit for being awkward, Ethan stopped her with a quiet look and said simply, "Do not do that here," and the words landed heavier than any instruction about posture or etiquette. Over the next weeks, a rhythm formed, public appearances followed by quiet evenings, Claire changing out of tailored dresses into soft sweaters, sitting at the dining table with her laptop open, helping Ethan review foundation proposals or listening as he spoke about decisions that carried the weight of thousands of employees, and slowly, without ceremony, she began to speak more freely, pointing out concerns, asking questions, disagreeing when something felt misaligned, and each time she did, Ethan listened, not as a CEO humoring a spouse, but as a man relieved to hear an unpolished truth. He noticed the way she kicked off her shoes the moment the door closed, the way she laughed softly at her own jokes, the way she grew animated when talking about small efficiencies others overlooked, and she noticed how he loosened his tie when thinking, how silence did not mean dismissal, how his reserve softened not through grand gestures, but through attention. The contract remained a presence, unspoken but understood, a boundary that kept them from naming the shift happening between them, because attraction was not loud or obvious. It was the quiet awareness of another person when no one else was watching. And as Claire stood one evening at the window, looking out over the city she used to feel invisible within, she realized that learning how to belong in Ethan's world was easy compared to the harder task of letting herself be seen exactly as she was. The first real test came on a night that mattered, not because of the chandeliers or the donors whose names carried weight in the city, but because everyone who could influence Ethan's future would be watching how his wife held herself when the room pressed back. The annual Caldwell Foundation Gala filled a historic hotel ballroom with a low hum of conversation, crystal glasses catching the light, black ties and practiced smiles forming an ecosystem Claire had learned to navigate without becoming part of it. And as she stepped inside beside Ethan, she felt the familiar tightening in her shoulders, the instinct to recede, checked only by the memory of the one condition she could not violate. She stayed herself. The board members approached in clusters, their greetings warm but measured, eyes flicking between Ethan and Claire with the curiosity reserved for unknown variables. And when questions came, they were rarely direct, framed instead as compliments that tested her footing, remarks about her background, her sudden visibility, the speed at which she had adapted. Claire answered calmly, not over-explaining, not shrinking, acknowledging her past without apology and her present without pretense, and the effect was subtle but immediate, a recalibration that shifted how the room received her. Midway through the evening, a senior partner known for his blunt assessments engaged her near the balcony doors, his tone courteous but edged, asking what qualified her to advise on foundation initiatives when others had spent decades in philanthropy. And Claire felt the eyes of nearby guests settle in, waiting. She did not look to Ethan. She spoke about listening first, about efficiency learned from necessity, about measuring impact not in press coverage, but in outcomes that lasted beyond a fiscal year. And she offered a specific adjustment to a proposal on the table, a small change that reduced overhead and expanded reach without diluting intent. The partner paused, then nodded once, the closest he came to approval, and the conversation moved on, leaving behind a ripple Claire felt more than saw. Later, as a reporter asked a question meant for Ethan and then redirected it to her, she answered with composure, redirecting credit, setting boundaries, refusing to perform warmth she did not feel, while remaining unfailingly respectful. And in that balance, she found steadiness. Ethan watched from a half-step back, not intervening, not rescuing, noticing the way the room adjusted around her authenticity rather than the other way around. And when applause rose for a donor recognition, he leaned in and murmured that she had done well, not as praise, but as acknowledgement. The drive home was quiet, city lights sliding past the windows, the tension ebbing now that the performance was complete, and in the penthouse, Claire kicked off her shoes and exhaled, the adrenaline giving way to reflection. She realized she had passed a test without knowing its full scope, not by becoming polished beyond recognition, but by refusing to be molded in private and public alike. And as she set her clutch on the table, she understood that the contract had not protected her tonight, her integrity had. Ethan poured water, set a glass beside her, and said nothing more, but the silence between them carried a new weight, the kind that forms when trust earns its first proof. The days after the gala unfolded more quietly, as if the city had exhaled with them, and in that softer rhythm, the space between Claire and Ethan became more noticeable, not in distance, but in attention. Morning started with shared coffee in the kitchen, steam rising from mugs as sunlight filtered across the floor, Claire reviewing her calendar while Ethan scanned headlines, their shoulders close enough to brush without touching, an intimacy neither acknowledged because acknowledging it would have meant naming something the contract forbade. One evening, after a long day that left Ethan unusually still, he remained at the dining table long after dinner plates had been cleared, staring at a document without reading it. And Claire, sensing the pause, asked if something was wrong, her voice gentle, not careful. He hesitated, then admitted that the board was pressuring him to move faster on a restructuring plan he believed would cost people their jobs without solving the underlying issue. And as he spoke, his composure thinned, revealing frustration edged with responsibility. Claire listened, not as a secretary anticipating his needs, but as the person he had asked to be honest in private, and she told him what she saw, that rushing would earn approval but lose trust, that leadership meant absorbing short-term discomfort to protect long-term stability, words she had never spoken aloud before because she had never believed she was invited to. Ethan absorbed her perspective in silence, then said quietly that he trusted her judgment, a statement that settled between them with surprising weight. Later that night, as rain streaked the windows and the city blurred into reflections, Claire found herself admitting something she had not planned to share, that being seen so publicly had awakened an old fear, that visibility invited loss, that her mother had taught her early to keep life small, because attention could vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind expectations she could not meet. Ethan did not interrupt. When he spoke, it was to confess that his insistence on emotional distance was not indifference, but defense, built from years of learning that affection in his world often came with conditions he could not afford to misunderstand. He said that asking her not to love him was the only way he knew to keep control, and as the words left him, Claire understood the paradox of their arrangement more clearly than ever, that honesty had drawn them closer even as the rules demanded restraint. The moment stretched, charged not by action but by awareness, the knowledge that care had already taken root despite every boundary designed to prevent it. And Claire shifted slightly, grounding herself by placing her hands flat on the table, reminding herself of the agreement she had signed with full intention. She told Ethan that whatever this was becoming, she would not be the one to break the terms, not because she felt nothing, but because integrity was the only anchor she trusted. He nodded, accepting the cost of that promise without protest, and the silence that followed was not empty, but full of everything left unsaid. When Claire finally stood to head toward her room, she paused, then turned back and thanked him for asking her to stay herself, because it had given her courage she did not know she had, and as she closed the door behind her, she rested her forehead against the wood, heart steady but changed, realizing that the hardest part of pretending was not hiding affection, but choosing restraint when connection felt earned. In the living room, Ethan remained at the table long after the rain stopped, staring at the city he had mastered and acknowledging that control had never felt more fragile or more worth reconsidering. The fracture came not with shouting or spectacle, but with a whisper that moved faster than truth ever did, starting as a rumor at a board luncheon and sharpening by the time it reached the business pages, a quiet suggestion that Ethan Caldwell's marriage was strategic rather than sincere, that the woman at his side had been selected, not loved. Claire learned about it the way she learned most things lately, through a polite smile that lingered a second too long, through a congratulatory message that carried an undertone she could not ignore, and finally through a call from a public relations director asking whether she would be available to address questions about the timing of her marriage relative to the merger announcement. The word contract was never spoken aloud, but it hovered close enough to sting. That evening, the pressure crystallized during a reception hosted by a longtime shareholder, an intimate gathering meant to reassure stability, where a woman Claire recognized from older photographs stepped forward with practiced warmth, introducing herself as someone who knew Ethan before success had changed him. Her questions were soft, almost friendly, but precise, probing for origin stories, for the speed of intimacy, for how well Claire truly knew her husband. And when Claire answered honestly, without embellishment, the woman smiled in a way that felt like confirmation. Later that night, a message appeared on a financial blog, speculative but confident, outlining the possibility of a contractual arrangement designed to placate the board, citing unnamed sources and circumstantial timing, and by morning, the calls began. Ethan moved swiftly, meetings scheduled back-to-back, legal counsel on standby, statements drafted and redrafted, but Claire watched the machine turn with a growing clarity that unsettled her more than fear ever could. This was the moment the contract had been designed to withstand, and yet she realized that remaining within it would require a silence that felt heavier than any consequence of leaving. When she finally spoke to Ethan, it was not in the boardroom or the office, but at home, in the quiet space they had learned to trust, and she told him that she would not stand beside him while others questioned her integrity on his behalf. She understood that dignity had cost her everything she had gained, and yet, for the first time since signing the contract, she felt entirely her own. Ethan did not sleep the night Claire left, not because the penthouse felt empty, but because it felt exposed, every surface reflecting the truth he had avoided, that control had been his language for safety, and it had finally failed him. By morning, he made a decision that startled even his closest advisors, canceling meetings, dismissing prepared statements, and calling for a press conference with no agenda beyond clarity. When the cameras came on, he stood alone at the podium, no spouse at his side, no shield of ambiguity, and spoke plainly, acknowledging that the marriage had begun as a structured agreement, that it had been designed to satisfy expectations rather than emotion, and that the woman he had asked to stand with him had refused to compromise her integrity when the cost became clear. He did not minimize the choice. He honored it. He stated that any stability earned by sacrificing honesty was not stability at all, and that if leadership meant anything, it meant accountability without conditions. The reaction was immediate and mixed, surprise threaded with respect, skepticism softened by the absence of spin, and when the questions pressed, he ended the conference himself, saying there would be no further comment because the matter was no longer strategic. Then he went to find her. Claire had returned to her old neighborhood, staying with her parents for a few days, the house familiar and grounding, and when Ethan knocked, she did not answer at first, assuming it was another well-meaning interruption, until her father opened the door, and stepped back without a word. Ethan stood in the entryway without the posture of negotiation, holding the slim folder that had once defined everything between them. He asked if he could speak, and when Claire appeared, guarded but steady, he placed the folder on the table and slid it toward her, open to the signature page, where his name had already been struck through. He told her that the contract was over, not suspended, not revised, ended by his choice, because any future he wanted could not be built on terms she had not set. He said he had spoken publicly not to protect the company, but to remove the shadow that followed her, and that whatever came next would be without leverage or expectation. Claire listened, arms folded, heart measured, and asked him what he wanted now, not what the world demanded. Ethan answered that he wanted to know her without a script, to earn trust without a timeline, and to accept a no without negotiation if that was her truth. He did not reach for her. He did not ask for forgiveness. He waited. The pause stretched, long enough for her to feel the weight of every careful choice she had made. And then she spoke, saying that dignity had been the price of leaving and she would not discount it, but that she had also seen who he became when control loosened, and that mattered. She told him she would not return as his wife, not yet, not under any label, but that she would consider meeting him as himself, somewhere public, somewhere ordinary, where neither of them could hide behind glass walls or expectations. Ethan nodded, relief quiet and real, and when he left, it was without certainty, but with something steadier, the knowledge that the first honest choice had finally been made. They met on a Saturday morning at a small neighborhood park near the river, the kind of place where joggers passed without noticing and dogs chased tennis balls with uncomplicated joy, and the simplicity of it steadied Claire in a way ballrooms never had. Ethan arrived early, dressed plainly, no driver waiting, no phone in hand, and when she approached, he smiled without calculation, the expression tentative and real. They walked first, talking about small things, coffee preferences, the rhythm of her parents' street, the way seasons felt different when you paid attention, and in that unguarded space, the ease surprised them both. Weeks followed with the same intention, lunches where no one knew their names, evenings where conversation wandered without agenda, and the careful rebuilding of trust happened not through declarations, but through consistency. Ethan listening when Claire spoke, Claire challenging him when something felt misaligned, neither pretending the past had not happened, neither allowing it to dictate the future. The company stabilized without spectacle, the board recalibrated, and Claire returned to work by choice in a role that matched her strengths, no longer hidden, no longer leveraged, simply valued. One evening, as autumn settled and the city softened into amber light, Ethan invited Claire to a quiet gallery opening supporting local artists, a project she had once mentioned in passing, and when they arrived, the walls held work that felt honest and unvarnished, stories told without permission. They stood before a piece that captured an ordinary street at dusk, and Ethan said that leadership had taught him scale, but she had taught him proportion, how to measure success by what endured. Outside, under a string of simple lights, he asked if she would walk with him, not as a contract, not as an image, but as a choice renewed daily, and when he reached into his pocket, it was not a spectacle, just a small ring chosen with care, offered without pressure. Claire did not answer immediately. She breathed, felt the ground beneath her feet, remembered the cost of dignity and the value of patience, and then she said yes, because this yes belonged to her, unencumbered and clear. The wedding came later, intimate and unannounced, held at the park where they had started again, with family close and laughter unforced, and when vows were spoken, they were promises shaped by restraint and truth rather than expectation. As the sun dipped and the city carried on, Claire rested her head against Ethan's shoulder, knowing that love had arrived not through grand conditions, but through the courage to end them, and in that quiet understanding, they stepped forward together, not as an arrangement fulfilled, but as a partnership chosen.